She rode into town with the name on her lips and a future in her hands. By sundown, both had been stolen from her, in front of everyone. The man she'd crossed 3 states to marry was standing on the church steps with another woman on his arm, laughing like Evelyn Hart didn't exist, like the letters didn't exist, like the promise didn't exist. And the whole town of Stone Creek watched. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stared at the woman with the worn travel bag and the dust still on her boots, standing in the middle of Main Street with nowhere left to go. If you've ever been humiliated by someone who was supposed to protect you, this story is for you. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach from Millfield arrived in Stone Creek at 3:30 on a Thursday afternoon, which was an unremarkable time for an unremarkable town, except that on this particular Thursday, the weekly supply wagon was late. 3 men were arguing outside the feed store over a property line that had been disputed for 11 years, and the Reverend's wife had just burned a pie that the whole street could smell. Nobody paid much attention to the coach pulling in. Nobody, that is, until the door swung open and a woman climbed down unassisted, because the driver was busy wrestling with a stuck luggage latch and hadn't offered his hand, and she landed on the packed dirt of Main Street with her chin up and her travel bag clutched against her side like it was the last solid thing in the world she trusted. Evelyn Hart was 26 years old. She had dark brown hair that had been pinned up neat that morning, but had suffered 3 hours of bad road, so several strands had pulled loose and curled against the back of her neck in a way she wasn't aware of. Her dress was clean but not fashionable, a deep blue wool that had been mended at the left sleeve, the stitching careful and close, the kind of repair that spoke more about the person who made it than any new dress could. Her boots were scuffed. Her bag was heavy. She stood still for a moment after she landed, the way people do when they've been moving for so long that stopping feels strange, like the ground isn't entirely sure it wants to hold them. Then she looked up and found the street. Stone Creek was not what the letter had described. Gerald Finch had written to her about a prospering town with a strong future and a community of good people. He'd written about his dry goods store on the main street, his house with the green shutters, and his plans for expansion. He'd written, in his careful, slightly formal hand, that he believed she would make a fine wife and that he was eager to begin their life together. She had read those letters so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She had read them to her mother before her mother passed. She had read parts of them to her neighbor, Mrs. Albright, who had clapped her hands together and said, "Oh, Evelyn, how wonderful," in a way that made Evelyn feel, for the first time in a long time, like something good was actually coming. She had traveled alone from Millfield, 3 days by rail and then 1 day by coach, with those letters folded in the inside pocket of her bag, close to everything else she owned. And now she was standing in Stone Creek, and it looked nothing like prospering. The buildings were functional, but weathered. The main street was wide and mostly empty at this hour. There was a feed store, a general goods shop, a small hotel with a crooked sign, a land office, a barber, and at the far end, a church with white paint that had been good once. A few horses were tied at the posts. A dog was asleep in the shade near the water trough. But none of that was what stopped her. What stopped her was the church steps. She saw him because Gerald Finch was not a man who went unnoticed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing a room would let him fill it. He was standing at the top of the church steps in a clean shirt, his dark hair combed back, and he was laughing at something. A real laugh, the kind that came from the belly, the kind she had imagined hearing when she finally arrived. He wasn't alone. The woman beside him was wearing yellow. Not working yellow, not everyday yellow, but a real dress, silk or something close to it, with lace at the collar and buttons that caught the afternoon light. She was fair-haired and pretty in a way that was easy and unconsidered, the way some women are pretty without trying, and she had her hand tucked inside Gerald Finch's arm like it had been there for a long time. Evelyn's feet stopped moving before she told them to. She stood in the middle of the street with her bag and her folded letters and her 3 days of travel, and she watched Gerald Finch lean down and say something close to the fair-haired woman's ear, something that made the woman laugh and press her gloved hand against his chest. The world got very quiet. Not actually quiet. The men were still arguing at the feed store. Someone's horse shifted and snorted. The wind moved dust along the ground. But inside Evelyn, everything went still and flat, the way a pond goes still, right before something heavy drops into it. Gerald looked up. He saw her. She watched his face change. It happened fast, the laugh fading, the ease draining out, something harder and careful sliding into its place. He straightened, said something to the woman beside him that she couldn't hear. The woman looked toward the street, found Evelyn, and her expression didn't change at all, which was somehow worse than if it had. Gerald came down the steps. Not quickly, not with any urgency. The walk of a man who had already decided how this conversation would go. He crossed the street toward her, and people started noticing. The arguing men went quiet. A woman who had been sweeping her porch stopped sweeping. The hotel clerk appeared in his doorway. Evelyn didn't move. Later, she wouldn't be able to explain why, whether it was pride or simply that her legs had stopped working, but she stood exactly where she was and let him come to her. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough that it wouldn't look like anything personal to the people watching. "Miss Hart," he said. "Not Evelyn. Not you're here. Not I'm sorry. Miss Hart." "Mr. Finch," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which surprised her. "I've come as we arranged." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him working through whatever he'd prepared to say, assembling it. "There's been a change in circumstances," he said. "I should have written. I meant to write." "You did write," she said. "Frequently." Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly, more like irritation at having that pointed out. "The last letter should have explained, there was no last letter." She said it plainly. "The last letter I received asked me to confirm my arrival date, which I did. And then I arrived." He exhaled through his nose, glanced back toward the woman in yellow, who had stayed on the church steps and was watching with a kind of polite neutrality that made Evelyn's chest ache in a specific, ugly way. "That's Miss Clara Whitmore," Gerald said. "Her father owns the Whitmore Lumber Company. We've recently come to an understanding." Evelyn said nothing. "These things happen," he continued, and now there was something defensive creeping into his voice, the thin edge of a man who knew he'd done wrong and had decided to be annoyed about being confronted with it instead of being ashamed. "Circumstances change. I'm sure you understand." "I understand that I traveled 3 days," Evelyn said. "I understand that I have $42 in a bag. I can return your travel cost. I didn't ask for your money." That shut him up for a moment. Around them, the street had gone properly quiet now. The arguing had stopped. The sweeping had stopped. Even the dog had opened one eye. Evelyn was aware of it, all of them watching, and she was aware of herself as they must be seeing her, alone, travel-worn, standing in the street being told that the life she'd come for had already been given to someone else. She was not going to cry. She was certain of that, in the way she was certain of very few things at that moment. She would not give this street, or Gerald Finch, or the woman in yellow that. But she also had no idea what she was going to do. $42 would pay for the hotel for maybe 2 weeks. The next stagecoach back to Millfield left in 4 days. And going back to Millfield meant going back to nothing. Her mother was gone, the house was sold, the neighbor Mrs. Albright's sympathy only extended so far. She had nowhere to go back to. That was the whole reason she'd come. "Is there anywhere in this town I might find work?" she asked. Her voice was still steady. She didn't know how, but it was. Gerald looked genuinely surprised by the question, like he'd expected tears or pleading, or some kind of scene he could walk away from feeling wronged by. The steadiness in her threw him off. "The hotel takes on help sometimes," he said. "Cleaning, kitchen work." "Thank you," she said. Just those 2 words. She picked up her bag, which she'd set down at some point without realizing it, and she turned away from him. She heard him say something else behind her, something that might have been an apology or might have been an explanation she hadn't asked for, but she didn't stop. She walked. She didn't know where she was walking to. She just walked. Rhett Calloway had been in town to pick up a bag of nails and a coil of wire fence he'd ordered 3 weeks ago, and that had, in the way of things in Stone Creek, arrived 2 weeks late. He'd been in the feed store when the stagecoach came in, had come out to load the wire onto his wagon bed, and had been doing exactly that. not watching the street, not paying attention. When the quality of the silence changed and made him look up, he'd seen the end of it mostly. The woman in the blue dress standing alone, the man saying his piece, the way she didn't flinch. He'd seen her ask something. He'd seen her pick up her bag and walk. He didn't know her, had never seen her before. Stone Creek wasn't a big town, but he spent most of his time out at the ranch, coming in for supplies once every 2 or 3 weeks. So there were faces he didn't recognize. But he recognized the walk. Not the specific walk of a specific person, but the walk of someone who is moving because they have to, because stopping would mean acknowledging that they don't know where they're going. He knew that walk. He'd walked it himself some years back after he'd buried his mother and come out of the church to find that the world had just kept going without asking whether he was ready. He finished loading the wire. He looked at her again. She'd stopped near the water trough. Not because she was thirsty, but because it was at the edge of the shade, and her options had apparently run out at that particular spot on the street. She stood there with her bag, looking at the hotel sign, doing arithmetic in her head that Rhett could practically see, counting whatever she had and finding it not enough. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself he didn't have the time, the energy, or the particular interest in getting involved in whatever situation had just unfolded on Main Street. He told himself these things, and then he tied off the last knot on the wire and crossed the street. She heard footsteps and turned, expecting she wasn't sure what. Someone with another piece of humiliation. Someone with pity, which would be nearly as bad. What she got was a man about as tall as Gerald Finch, but built differently. Not the comfortable breadth of a merchant, but the harder, leaner build of someone who worked outdoors in all weather. He had dark hair that needed cutting, jaw that needed shaving 2 days ago, and he was wearing a work shirt with dust on the left shoulder from loading something heavy. His boots were well used. He stopped at what she privately noted was a respectful distance. Not crowding. "I'm Rhett Calloway," he said. Not ma'am, not miss, just his name, like he was establishing that this was a transaction between people and not a performance of manners. "I run Iron Ridge Ranch, about 6 miles north." Evelyn looked at him. "I'm Evelyn Hart." "I know," he said. "Word travels fast in a small town." Apparently. There was a slight edge to it, but she didn't apologize for it. He didn't react to the edge, just moved past it. "I came into town for supplies and I'm heading back out in about 20 minutes. If you're looking for work, I need someone at the ranch, cooking and keeping house, mostly. It's honest work and it pays fair." She studied him. There was a version of this situation where a woman alone accepted work from a strange man, and it was the worst decision she ever made. She was aware of that version. She was aware of it very specifically, actually. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't know me either." "No." "Then why would you offer me work?" He seemed to think about it for a moment, genuinely think, not just reach for a comfortable answer. "Because I watched you just now," he said, "and you held up." She didn't know what to do with that. "What does the work pay?" she asked. $8 a month, room and board included. You'd have your own room off the kitchen." He said it without inflection, like he was quoting a number for the wire fence he'd just loaded. $8 a month wasn't much, but it was a room that wasn't the hotel, board that wasn't coming out of her $42, and it wasn't going back to Millfield. "Who else is at the ranch?" she asked. "My father. He's getting on in years. A hired hand named Cole who mostly keeps to the barn. That's it." She looked at him for another moment. He stood there and let her look, didn't fidget or try to fill the silence with more persuasion. That more than anything was what decided her. Men who were trying to maneuver a woman into something kept talking. Men who were simply stating facts let you have your silence. "I'll take the position," she said. The wagon ride north was mostly quiet. Evelyn sat on the bench beside Rhett with her bag wedged between her feet, and Stone Creek fell away behind them, and the land opened up into the kind of wide, dry-grassed expanse that had a certain severity to it. Not beautiful in any soft way, but honest. Big sky, real distance. The mountains at the far rim of the valley wore their snow like something they'd earned. "How long has the ranch been in your family?" she asked, after a mile or so. "My grandfather built the house," Rhett said. "My father ran cattle until a few years back. We still run some, but it's smaller now." "Why smaller?" A pause. The horses moved over a rut and he adjusted the reins. Things happen, he said, not closing the conversation off, Chad. Just the same kind of plainness he'd shown before, like he was giving her the honest short version without dressing it up. She nodded and looked out at the land. I should tell you, he said, after another half-mile. The house isn't in the best order. My father hasn't been. He keeps to himself. I can't say it'll be comfortable right away. I'm not expecting comfortable, she said. I'm expecting honest. He glanced at her then, brief, sideways. That I can give you. Iron Ridge Ranch appeared around a long curve in the road. First the fence line, then the barn, then the house. The house was a substantial structure which surprised her. 2 stories, stone foundation, a porch that ran the full length of the front. It had been fine once, she could see that. The bones of it were good. But the garden was completely gone to weeds, the porch boards showed gray and warped where they'd been neglected. One of the shutters on the upper windows hung at a wrong angle, and the whole place had the feeling of something that had given up on itself. It made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected. Rhett brought the wagon to a stop near the porch and wrapped the reins. He climbed down and she climbed down, and he got her bag from behind the seat and held it out to her. I'll show you the kitchen first, he said. You'll have questions. Yes, she said, looking at the house. I expect I will. Inside was better and worse simultaneously. Better because the structure was solid, good floors, high ceilings, a kitchen that was actually generously sized with a large iron stove and a stone sink and shelves that had been built to last. Worse, because the kitchen looked like it had been surviving rather than living. There were dishes that had been washed adequately but without care. There were shelves that held what was necessary and nothing more. The curtain over the single window was gray with dust and had once been something with a pattern, though the pattern was past identifying. The rest of the downstairs was the same. A front room with a fireplace that had been lit recently but showed cold ash, furniture that was functional and old, a dining table that looked like it hadn't had more than one person sitting at it in a long time. My father usually eats in his room, Rhett said from behind her. His voice was careful, like he was watching for her reaction. She turned to look at him. Why? He seemed slightly surprised she had asked directly. He finds it easier? Easier how? Another of his pauses. My mother died 4 years ago. He took it. He stopped wanting to sit at the table after that. Evelyn looked at the table. It was a good table, heavy oak with 6 chairs around it. 6 chairs for a house with 2 people. She had a sudden clear image of what that table had looked like when it was full. I see, she said. She didn't add anything to it, which seemed to be the right choice because something in Rhett's shoulders settled slightly. He showed her the rest of the house, the room off the kitchen that would be hers. Small, clean enough, with a window that looked toward the east, which she noted because she liked morning light. The stairs, the upper landing, the fact that his father's room was at the back of the 2nd floor. Should I meet him today? She asked. I'll let him know you're here, Rhett said. He'll come down when he's ready. She got the impression when he's ready might mean eventually or might mean not for a while, but she didn't push it. She unpacked her bag in her room. It didn't take long. There wasn't much. 2 other dresses, a pair of working shoes, the mended wool for colder weather, her mother's small sewing kit in a tin box, the letters from Gerald Finch at the bottom. She stood there for a moment with the letters in her hand. She should throw them away. There was no logical reason to keep them, but she set them back down in the bag, still folded, still soft at the creases, and told herself she'd deal with them later. That was a lie she was willing to tell herself for now. Then she went to the kitchen and started figuring out what she had to work with. The pantry told its own story. There were staples: flour, salt, cornmeal, dried beans, some cured ham, potatoes beginning to soften, a few onions, lard, coffee. Not abundance, but not nothing. Enough to cook from if you knew what you were doing, which Evelyn did, because she had cooked for herself and her mother for the last 3 years of her mother's illness, and necessity had made her competent in ways she'd never expected to need. She found a cast iron pot with good seasoning, a skillet, a Dutch oven, and basic utensils. She started with soup. It was an unsexy choice, but it was the right one. A large pot of ham and bean soup with onion and the softening potatoes, because it required no fanfare, would fill the house with smell and could be left to cook while she started understanding the rest of her situation. While it cooked, she cleaned the kitchen. Not just cleaned, she took everything off the shelves, wiped them down, found the pattern on the curtain was actually a small blue flower. She soaked it in the sink and wrung it out and hung it back damp. It would show its flowers again when it dried. Reorganized the pantry so she could see what she had and swept the floor twice. She'd been working for maybe 2 hours when she heard the back door, which she'd left open for the air. Rhett came in and stopped. He looked at the kitchen. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. Not surprise exactly, but something that was surprise adjacent. "Soup's got another hour," she said, without turning from what she was doing, which was wiping down the stove. "If there's bread flour, I can start a loaf tomorrow, but I don't want to attempt it tonight." "There's bread flour," he said. He was still standing in the doorway. She could tell by the sound of his voice, or rather by its lack of movement. "In the tin on the second shelf." "I'll find it." She turned then. "Your father, does he have any foods he won't eat? Anything that bothers him?" Rhett blinked, like the specificity of the question was unexpected. "Not that I know of. He used to eat everything." "Good." She turned back to the stove. "Dinner will be ready in an hour." She heard him hesitate, then heard him move into the house, footsteps on the stairs. A few minutes later, the sound of a knock. A low exchange she couldn't make out. She set the table. She set it for 3. She used the good dishes that she'd found in the cabinet, the ones with the blue rim that had been stacked unused behind the everyday ones. They weren't fancy, but they were proper, the kind of dishes a family used for meals that mattered. She set 3 places and put the soup pot in the center and a plate of the cornbread she'd put together at the last minute because she'd found cornmeal, and there was nothing hard about cornbread if you had fat and a hot oven. Rhett came down first. He looked at the table. He looked at the 3 places. He didn't say anything about it. He sat down. 10 minutes passed. Evelyn brought the bread in from the oven and set it on the table and sat down herself, and she was reaching for the ladle when she heard the stairs. Slow, deliberate. The sound of someone who had not been downstairs in a while and was taking it one step at a time. Elias Calloway appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 70 or aged toward it by grief, which did something different to a person than years did. He was thin in the way of a man who had stopped seeing much point in eating. His hair was fully white and uncombed, and he was wearing clothes that were clean but had the look of things he'd put on without thinking too hard about it. He had Rhett's dark eyes, but where Rhett's eyes were watchful and reserved, Elias's were something dimmer. Not stupid, not empty, but like a lamp turned down low. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the table, at the 3 places, at the soup, at Evelyn, who he had never seen before in his life. For a moment she thought he was going to turn around and go back upstairs, and she would not have been surprised by it, and had decided not to take it personally. Instead, he said, in a rough voice that hadn't been used much recently, "You put flowers back on the curtain." "They were already there," she said. "Just needed water." He looked at the curtain, at the small blue flowers showing themselves in the damp fabric hanging in the window. Then he came to the table and sat down. He didn't say anything else. He sat in the chair at the head of the table, which she'd understood instinctively was his chair, the way some chairs just belonged to someone. And he picked up his spoon. She served the soup. They ate. It wasn't a warm meal in the storybook way. There was no conversation, no laughter, no sudden healing of anything. Elias ate slowly and said nothing. Rhett ate with the particular focus of a man who had gone too many hours without food. Evelyn ate and watched the curtain moving slightly in the evening air. But when Elias finished his bowl, he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "That's a good soup." And Rhett looked up from his plate, and Evelyn said, "Thank you. I'll do a better one tomorrow when I've figured out the kitchen." And Elias said nothing else, but he didn't leave. He sat there while they finished eating, and after a while he put his hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table, and he didn't look quite so dim. The first week was an education. Evelyn learned the rhythms of the ranch. Rhett was up before light. Cole arrived at the barn around 6 and left at sundown without coming to the house much. Elias came down for breakfast after 7 and moved through the day quietly, sitting on the porch sometimes, reading sometimes, doing not much else. She cooked 3 meals a day. She cleaned systematically, room by room, taking it seriously. She mended the shutter on the upper window, which turned out to only need 2 new screws, and was up a ladder doing it before Rhett came in from the fields and found her there. "I could have done that," he said from below. "It's done now," she said, coming down the ladder. He looked at the shutter, hanging straight. "Where'd you find the screws?" "The barn. Cole helped me find them." She folded the ladder. He's quiet, but he knew where everything was. Rhett took the ladder from her. Not from her hands exactly, but he reached for it and she let him have it because it wasn't worth arguing about. "Cole's worked here 9 years," he said. "He's particular about the ranch." "I could tell," she said. He was polite about it. Something in Rhett's expression shifted, almost a question, and she understood that he was slightly surprised that Cole had been polite to her. She filed that away. Mum. She didn't go back to town for 10 days. The first time she went for supplies, she felt the weight of the place before she'd even climbed down from the wagon. Stone Creek watched her. Not everyone, not obviously, but she could feel it, the slight pause in conversations as she passed, the way one woman looked at her and then looked deliberately away, the way 2 men outside the barber shop tracked her as she walked by without appearing to. She'd been the spectacle. She was still the spectacle, just a slower burning one now. She kept her chin level and walked to the general store. The woman behind the counter was maybe 50, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had formed its opinions early and hadn't been much disturbed by new information since. "Miss Hart," the woman said when Evelyn came in. Not warmly. "Mrs. Poole," Evelyn said, because she'd gathered names from context. "I need flour, sugar, coffee, dried fruit, if you have it, baking powder, and 2 spools of white thread." Mrs. Poole pulled the items without speaking much, but near the end said, in the particular tone of a woman who is being helpful, "It's a solitary life out at Iron Ridge, I'd think, especially for a woman." "Most lives have some solitude," Evelyn said. "Mr. Calloway's a hard man," Mrs. Poole said. Not unkindly exactly, but with a certain weight. "He's been straightforward with me," Evelyn said. "I find that easier to work with than the opposite." A brief pause. Mrs. Poole's eyes went slightly calculating. "Of course," she said. Evelyn paid for her supplies and carried them herself to the wagon. She was loading the last bag when she heard heels on the boardwalk and looked up to find Clara Whitmore stepping out of the millinery shop across the street. Clara was as pretty in daylight as she'd been on the church steps. She was wearing something pale green today, and her hair was up, and she moved through the street the way women move when they've grown up in a place and know they belong to it. She saw Evelyn. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Clara crossed the street. Evelyn stood beside the wagon and waited for her. "Miss Hart," Clara said. Her voice was pleasant, careful. "Miss Whitmore," Evelyn said. Clara looked at the bags in the wagon, at Evelyn's working dress, at her hands which showed the last 2 weeks of scrubbing and cooking. "I wanted to say," she paused, seemed to be choosing words. "I didn't know about you. When Gerald and I didn't know there was an arrangement." Evelyn studied her. "I believe you," she said. Clara looked slightly surprised. "Men like Gerald Finch don't tend to advertise all their arrangements," Evelyn said. "That would defeat the purpose." Something flickered in Clara's expression, complicated, a little uncertain. "He said you were a possibility he'd been corresponding with, but that nothing had been decided." "He said that," Evelyn said. "It wasn't really a question." "Yes." She looked at Clara Whitmore for a long moment, looked at the good dress and the soft hands and the slightly anxious expression of a woman who had found out that the man she'd accepted had been running 2 tracks at once. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I don't blame you, but I'd suggest you pay some attention to what kind of man considers a woman a possibility while writing her letters about green shutters and a future together." Clara went still. Evelyn climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Good afternoon," she said, and picked up the reins. She didn't look back. Rhett didn't ask about town when she got home, but he unloaded the supplies without being asked, and when she was sorting them in the pantry, she heard him say from the kitchen doorway, "Stone Creek talk much?" "Some," she said. "They'll get bored of it." "I know." She put the coffee on the shelf. "It doesn't matter much to me anyway." She felt him watching her. "What does matter to you?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not a prying one, the flat, honest way he had of asking things. She thought about it. "Good work done right," she said. "Honesty. Watching things that were broken get fixed." She turned and found him still in the doorway, with his arms crossed, listening. "Why?" "Just trying to understand what kind of person I've got working here," he said. "Fair enough," she said. "And?" He raised an eyebrow. She allowed the smallest thing that wasn't quite a smile. "And I'm still deciding what kind of person you are." He looked at her for a moment. Something almost humorous moved across his face. Brief, there, and gone. "Fair enough," he said, and went back outside. The night that changed things with Elias happened in the third week. Evelyn couldn't sleep. She'd woken at some point in the gray dark before dawn and lay there for a while before deciding sleep wasn't coming back. She went to the kitchen to start the coffee and found Elias already there, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Not doing anything. Just sitting. She paused in the doorway. "I'll light the lamp," she said. "Don't," he said. His voice was rough with not sleeping. "It's fine like this." She went to the stove and started building the fire, doing it quietly, finding the shape of things by touch and the faint light through the window. After a while the fire caught and the stove began its low work, and she put the coffee on. She sat down across from him. Not right across. At the corner, leaving space. They sat together in the gray dark with the stove beginning to tick, and for a long time neither of them spoke. "She used to get up early," Elias said. Evelyn didn't say anything. "Margaret, my wife." His voice was careful, like someone touching something that still hurt. "She was always the first up, had the coffee on before I even knew I was awake. I'd come down and it was just—" He stopped, looked at the table. "It was just ready." Evelyn looked at the stove. "She grew those curtains," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I can tell." He looked up at her. "The way they're made," she said. "Someone who cared what they looked like. The hemming is very neat." Elias was quiet for a moment. "She cared about everything being done right," he said. "Drove me crazy when I was young and in a hurry." He paused. "I'd give a good deal to have her drive me crazy again." The stove ticked. Outside, a nightbird called once and was quiet. "She sounds like someone worth missing," Evelyn said. Elias looked at her for a long moment with those dimmed-down eyes. "She was," he said. The coffee came ready. Evelyn poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and held the other in her hands, and they sat there in the kitchen while the sky outside the window began its slow change from black to gray. Later, she understood that this was the morning things shifted. Not dramatically. There was no announcement, no ceremony. But after that morning, Elias came to breakfast without being reminded. He started leaving his door open during the day. He asked her, a few days later, if she knew how to play checkers. She didn't. He taught her. Cool. It was Cole who told her about the whispers toward the end of the second month. Cole was a compact, weathered man of maybe 40 who communicated primarily through brief sentences and the angle of his hat. He'd been friendly enough, in his way, answering her questions about the barn and the horses and where things were kept. He didn't offer information freely, but he wasn't unforthcoming if you asked. He found her one morning in the garden. She'd started reclaiming it slowly in the hours when the kitchen work was done, pulling weeds and turning the soil and trying to remember what her mother had planted and in what order. And he stood at the edge of it with his hat in his hands. "Miss Hart," he said. "Cole." She sat back on her heels. "Is something wrong?" "I was in town yesterday," he said. "Overheard some things." He turned the hat. "Figured you ought to know." She waited. "Gerald Finch has been talking," Cole said, "about why things didn't work out. His version, I mean. His version has you, arriving unexpected without proper arrangement. Has you showing up without... He's making it sound like you came without being wanted." She kept her face still. "He's been talking to a few men," Cole continued, "about some money he says he's owed, some arrangement he says that he was promised as part of bringing you out here." Evelyn went very still. "What kind of arrangement?" she said. Cole looked uncomfortable. "Like a payment for marrying from your family." She stared at him. "From her family, from her brother." She hadn't thought about her brother Daniel in the 2 months since she'd left Millfield. She'd tried not to. Daniel was 5 years older and had been managing, or mismanaging, the remnants of their family's property since their father died. He was not a bad man, but he was a desperate one, and desperate men in difficult positions made choices that they could justify to themselves in small pieces. He'd arranged her marriage, not as a kindness, not because Gerald Finch was a good man who would take care of her, as a transaction. She thought about the letters, the careful hand, the slightly formal language. She thought about Gerald standing on the church steps and saying circumstances change with the slightly annoyed tone of a man whose business deal had gone sideways. She thought about there was supposed to be payment. "Thank you, Cole," she said. Her voice was very even. "I appreciate you telling me." He nodded, turned the hat once more. "I've worked for the Callaways a long time," he said. I know what it is when someone's doing right by this place." He looked at the garden, the turned soil, the cleared beds. "Thought you ought to know what was being said." He put his hat back on and went back to the barn. Evelyn stayed in the garden for a long time after he left, her hands in the soil, the sun warm on the back of her neck. Then she got up, washed her hands at the pump, and went inside to think about what she was going to do. She started by writing to her brother. She wrote it at the kitchen table after dinner when the house was quiet by lamplight. She didn't write it in anger, though the anger was there, deep down, underneath the steadiness, an anger that had weight and heat, and had been building since Cole's words settled into what they meant. She wrote it carefully and specifically, asking him direct questions, leaving no room for comfortable evasions. "Did you arrange my travel to Stone Creek as part of a financial agreement with Gerald Finch? Did you promise him money in exchange for the marriage? Did you know he had no intention of honoring the arrangement that he described to me?" She sealed it and sent it with Cole when he went to town the next morning. Then she waited. And while she waited, she cooked and she cleaned and she worked in the garden and she played checkers with Elias and she learned the rhythms of the ranch and she watched the mountains at the edge of the valley change their shadows through the day. She was still waiting when Rhett found her on the porch one evening, sitting in the chair that nobody had sat in until she'd started sitting in it, watching the last of the light leave the western sky. He sat down in the other chair without asking. They did that sometimes, sat without preamble, which she'd found she didn't mind. "Cole told me," he said. She kept her eyes on the horizon. "I figured he would." "He was right to." He shifted in the chair. "What are you going to do?" "I wrote to my brother," she said. "I want to know what he actually agreed to before I decide anything else." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "If there are forged documents," he said, "if someone's built a paper case against you, then I'll need to find out what the paper says before I can counter it." She turned and looked at him. "I'm not running from it." He met her eyes. In the dimming light, his face was harder to read than usual, but she thought she saw something in it that wasn't the usual reserve, something that took the statement seriously, that recognized it as a declaration and didn't dismiss it. "No," he said, "I didn't think you would." The sky went dark, degree by degree. The first stars came out over the mountains. The night insects started up. They sat there for a while longer, not talking, until the dark was complete. And in the house behind them, Elias Callaway moved around in the kitchen. They could hear him, the sound of him making himself coffee without waiting to be served it, a thing he hadn't done in 4 years. Rhett heard it too. He said nothing, but something in the line of his shoulders changed, the way a man's does when something tight has finally been allowed to come loose. The porch boards were old and creaked where she'd shifted. The night was cool and smelled of sage and turned earth. Evelyn Hart sat in the dark and thought about what was coming, and found that for the first time since she'd climbed down from that stagecoach into the dust of Stone Creek's main street, she wasn't afraid. Angry, yes. Resolute, yes. But not afraid. And that, she thought, was different from how she'd started. That was different from how she'd been every day before she came to a broken house on a struggling ranch, and found, in the quiet work of making it whole again, that she had not been broken at all. And sick. The letter from her brother arrived 8 days later, and what it contained was worse than she had imagined, and exactly what she had suspected. The letter from Daniel Hart arrived on a Tuesday, folded inside a plain envelope with no return address, which told her something before she'd even opened it. She read it twice at the kitchen table while the morning coffee went cold beside her. Then she set it down flat on the wood and looked at the wall for a while. It wasn't a confession. Daniel wasn't built for those. What it was, instead, was a careful assembly of half-truths and reasonable-sounding justifications stacked on top of each other like a wall built to keep her out. He wrote that he had facilitated an introduction. Those were his words, facilitated an introduction between her and Gerald Finch, and that in exchange for the introduction, there had been a modest compensation agreement which he described as standard practice for arranged situations of this kind. He wrote that he had been in a difficult financial position and that he had genuinely believed, that Gerald Finch would be a suitable husband and that the arrangement would benefit everyone. He did not say he was sorry. He wrote, near the end, that if there were any remaining financial obligations being discussed, she should know that he had fulfilled his end of the arrangement in good faith, and that any claims against her personally were outside the scope of what he'd agreed to. She read that line 3 times. Any claims against her personally, which meant he knew there were claims, which meant he had heard something from somewhere, and his letter was arriving not because he felt guilty, but because he was protecting himself from being named in whatever was coming. She folded the letter back along its creases and set it with the others in the tin box she kept in her room. And then she went back to the kitchen and poured the cold coffee down the sink and made a fresh pot, because it was still a working day and there were still meals to cook, and she had learned in the last few months that the work was the thing that kept you from spinning out. She was cracking eggs into the skillet when she heard Rhett come in the back door. He stopped when he saw her face. She didn't know what her face was doing. She wasn't trying to show anything. But he had developed a particular skill for reading her in the months they'd been working alongside each other. A skill she hadn't exactly given him permission to develop, but that had developed anyway through proximity and habit and the fact that some people just paid attention. "Letter came," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She turned the eggs. He knew about it. He arranged it. He calls it a facilitated introduction with a modest compensation agreement. She kept her voice flat, not from effort exactly, but because the flatness was what was available right now, the anger having gone somewhere deep and still, the way very hot things sometimes get very quiet. Rhett sat down at the table. He didn't say anything immediately, which she appreciated. "He's also heard that there are claims being made against me," she said. "He didn't warn me. He wrote to cover himself." "What kind of claims?" She set the eggs on plates and brought them to the table and sat down across from him, and they talked through it the way they'd started doing things. Directly, without preamble, treating each other like people capable of handling the full picture. She laid out what Cole had told her, what Daniel's letter confirmed by implication, what she suspected Gerald Finch was building toward. A financial claim. Documents, possibly, showing a debt she'd never agreed to. Money Daniel had promised and not delivered, reframed as an obligation that followed her rather than him. Rhett ate and listened. "He can't make a debt stick that you didn't sign," he said. "Not if I knew about it," she said, but if there are documents with a signature." "Your signature?" "Or something that looks like mine." She picked up her fork. "Daniel handled the correspondence with Finch. He could have put my name to something. He would have told himself it was on my behalf." The kitchen was quiet except for the morning sounds of the ranch waking up. Cole moving around in the barn, a horse shifting, the distant sound of wind finding the gap in the porch boards that she'd been meaning to mention. "What do you want to do?" Rhett asked. "I want to know exactly what's been filed, if anything. I want to see what documents exist." She looked at him steadily. "And then I want to deal with it properly. Not run from it, not wait for it to find me." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the short nod of a man who has decided something. "I know a man in Harlow County who handles legal matters. Straight shooter, been around long enough that he knows what forgery looks like." He drank his coffee. "I can write out to him." "I'll come with you," she said. He started to say something. She could see it forming, the automatic mail calculation about whether she needed to be shielded from the logistical ugliness of it. And then he stopped and reconsidered and said instead, "Day after tomorrow. I need to get the north fence looked at first." "Day after tomorrow," she agreed. She heard the stairs then, the slow, deliberate sound of Elias coming down, and she got up to pour him his coffee and start the toast. And the morning moved forward the way mornings did. The things she didn't say to Rhett, the things she sat with alone in the hours between working and sleeping, was the specific hurt of Daniel's letter, not the legal danger of it, that she could strategize around, could address, could fight. But the fact of it, that her brother had looked at her life, at her situation after their mother died and the house was sold, and she had nothing and no one, and had seen in it not a sister who needed help, but an asset to be leveraged, had found a way to turn her loneliness into something useful to him. She had told herself, when she left Millfield, that she was traveling toward something, a choice, a real future. She had told herself that Gerald Finch's letters had been honest and that she was exercising judgment, not desperation. Now she understood that she had been moved, not choosing. The whole thing had been arranged around her, and she'd been the last to know it, which was the particular kind of humiliation that didn't scream, that just sat quietly in your chest and breathed. She didn't cry about it. She thought she might at some point, and she'd let herself when the time came. But right now there wasn't space for it, and she'd learned that some griefs had patience and would wait. What nobody had told her, and what she discovered slowly over the weeks that followed, was that Iron Ridge Ranch had its own kind of life that had been waiting underneath the neglect. She'd started the garden as practical necessity: fresh vegetables, herbs for cooking, something to reduce the supply runs. But as she cleared and turned and planted, she began to see the shape of what the garden had been. Margaret Calloway had planted it with intention. There were perennials coming back from what had been abandoned. A sprawl of sage along the south wall, lavender that had survived 3 winters of no care, a climbing rose on the fence that had gone entirely wild but was putting out growth now that the weeds weren't choking it. She worked in it every morning before the kitchen work started, in the early light, and she found it was the hour she thought most clearly. Her hands in the ground, the cold air on her face, the mountains pink at their edges. One morning she looked up from pulling a root and found Elias standing at the garden gate. He hadn't come outside much, she'd noticed. The porch, occasionally, in the afternoon, but not the garden. She planted all of this, he said from the gate. Not a question. I know, Evelyn said. I've been trying to follow what she laid out. The spacing is still showing. He pushed the gate open and came in, walked slowly along the path, looking at things. He stopped near the climbing rose and looked at it for a long time. She brought that cutting from her mother's house, he said, in a jar of water wrapped in cloth, carried it 3 days in a wagon. He touched one of the new canes gently. I told her it would never survive the trip. He paused. She didn't particularly care what I thought. Evelyn sat back on her heels. Did she often not care what you thought? Something crossed his face that might have been the ancestor of a smile. More than I preferred at the time, he said. Less than I realized was keeping me honest. He came and looked at what she'd cleared, the new beds, the things coming back. You've got the lavender coming, he said. She was always fighting to keep it. I know, I've been careful around it. He crouched down, which took him some effort. His knees gave him trouble, she'd noticed, and pinched a bit of the lavender between his fingers and held it to his nose, closed his eyes for a second. Then he stood back up with some difficulty and looked at her. You don't have to save everything, he said. Some of it might just be past. Maybe, she said, but I'd rather find out than assume. He looked at her for a moment. That's a tiring way to live. Yes, she agreed, but it's mine. He made a sound that was either acknowledgement or old man skepticism. She couldn't tell which, and he walked back to the gate and out of the garden. But the next morning he came back, and the morning after that, and after a while he started telling her things about the garden. What Margaret had done, what had worked, what she'd sworn at in frustration. And Evelyn listened and used what was useful, and the garden began slowly to become something again. The ride to Harlow County took most of a day. The legal man Rhett had mentioned was named Aldous Webb, and he worked out of a small office above the land registry, accessible by an external staircase that looked like it had been built by someone who respected function and not at all style. He was maybe 60, with a white mustache and reading glasses he wore on top of his head when he wasn't reading and pushed down to his nose when he was, and he received them without ceremony, cleared a stack of papers off 2 chairs, and listened to everything Evelyn laid out without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up his pen and turned it in his fingers. You have the letters from Finch? He asked. Yes. Here. She'd brought them, all of them, in order, with the dates. She'd also brought Daniel's most recent letter. He read through them slowly, very slowly. She sat across from him and resisted the urge to watch his face for reactions, and looked at the wall instead, which had a survey map of the county pinned to it with the corners curling. Rhett sat beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. "Your brother's letter is interesting," Aldous Webb said, after a while, without looking up. "He says any remaining financial obligations and outside the scope of what he agreed to." He set the letter down. "He's heard from Finch recently. That language is protective. He's drawing a line between himself and whatever Finch is building." "That's what I thought," Evelyn said. "What Finch will likely do, if he moves at all, is present a signed promissory note. Your name on it, some amount. Frame it as a dowry debt, something the bride's family committed to." He looked at her over the reading glasses. "Did you sign anything? Any document ever regarding your travel or the arrangement?" "No." "Did your brother show you any documents with your name on them before you left?" "No." "Then if a document exists with your signature, it was written after the fact." He tapped the letter. "The question is whether he moves on it or whether he lets it go. Men like Finch, by merchants who leverage social standing, they usually don't file claims that could expose how the debt was created in the first place. The creation of that debt is its own problem for him." "He might not file," Rhett said, "but he can still talk." "Yes," Aldous Webb said, "he can talk. And in a town the size of Stone Creek, talking does its own damage." There was a silence. "What would you recommend?" Evelyn asked. He looked at her with the direct, appraising look of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that some people wanted honest counsel and some people wanted reassurance, and that these were very different things. "Keep your letters," he said. "Keep everything with a date on it. If a document surfaces with your name, you bring it to me immediately. And," he paused, "don't hide. That's the mistake people make when they're afraid of a reputation attack. They go quiet and let the other story fill the space." "I'm not in the habit of going quiet," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "No, I can see that." He made a few notes on a pad of paper and tore the sheet off and handed it to her. "Write to the land office in your home county. Request any documents filed in your name in the last year. Sometimes these things get placed quietly before the target knows to look." She took the paper. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "This may come to nothing, or it may get worse before it gets better. I can't tell you which." "I know," she said. "That's all right." They rode back mostly quiet, as they often did, except that somewhere in the second hour Rhett said, without looking at her, "You handled that well." She looked at the road ahead. He was straightforward. It's easier when people are straightforward. "Most people aren't." "No," she said. "They're not." The horses moved, and the distance shortened between them and the ranch. And the mountains did what they always did, which was stand there looking old and indifferent and somehow steadying because of it. October came in cold. The first frost hit the garden on a Tuesday night, and she'd known it was coming. The smell in the air the previous evening had told her. And she'd covered what she could with old cloth and burlap, and in the morning she went out to find that most of it had survived. The lavender was fine. The rose had dropped its new leaves but would come back. She lost the last of the tomatoes, which she'd been expecting, and brought in the remaining onions and the small beets she'd been nurturing along the south bed. She made a soup from them that night that was better than anything she'd made yet, dark and sweet and earthy from the beets, with the last of the cured ham and the dried herbs she'd put up in September. And Elias had 2 bowls and said nothing except that it reminded him of something. "Of what?" she asked. He looked at the bowl. "November 1869, he said. "We'd had a bad summer, lost a lot of cattle. Margaret made a beet soup from the last of the kitchen garden, and we sat in here for about 2 hours eating it and not talking about how worried we were." He was quiet. It was somehow still a good night. Evelyn looked at him. "The soup's the same," she said. "The worry's different." "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it isn't." She didn't know exactly what he meant by that. But she thought about it for a long time after he'd gone to bed, sitting in the kitchen with the lamp going low, listening to the house settle in the cold. The thing about old grief, she was learning, was that it moved around. Elias had been drowning in it when she arrived. She could see that now, looking back, the gray, diminished quality of him, the way he'd given up on the table and the meals and the daily motions of a life engaged with the world. He'd been doing the necessary things and nothing else, waking, surviving, sleeping, waiting for it to be over, maybe not in any dramatic sense, but in the way of a man who has lost the specific gravity that kept him interested in his own future. And she hadn't fixed that. She wanted to be clear to herself about that. She hadn't arrived and healed him with her cooking and her elbow grease and her practical country warmth. It wasn't like that. It was slower and messier, and involved several evenings where he'd sat at the dinner table and said nothing and gone back upstairs and she'd washed the dishes alone, wondering if anything was actually changing. But something had shifted. She wasn't sure when exactly. Somewhere between the curtains and the garden and the checkers games and the early morning in the kitchen with the cold coffee. Somewhere in there he'd started coming back, degree by degree, the lamp turned up a little higher. She thought it was mostly about being taken seriously, about someone treating his grief not as a problem to solve, but as a fact to live around. She hadn't tried to talk him out of it or rush him through it. She just kept cooking, kept setting 3 places, kept the house going in a way that said someone here still expects things to happen. And eventually he'd started expecting things to happen again too. She was not romantic about this. She knew it could reverse. She knew grief wasn't linear and that there would be bad days, and that sometimes the bad days would be very bad. But for now the lamp was higher, and she was grateful for it. Rhett was harder to read than his father, which was saying something. In the early weeks, she'd assessed him practically. Responsible, unsentimental, honest about the ranch's difficulties. Fair with the money, consistent. He didn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He didn't explain himself more than was required. He worked harder than anyone she'd seen, which she hadn't expected from a man who employed help. But Iron Ridge Ranch was a place where there was always more to do than there were hands to do it. And Rhett didn't appear to be the kind of man who stood outside work while others did it. What she learned more slowly was the rest of it. The way he'd kept this ranch going through 3 bad years, not selling when he could have, not walking away from the land his grandfather had broken and his father had grown, even when it might have been the practical decision. She'd found out through Cole, who offered information in small pieces when she'd earned his trust enough, that the years after Margaret Calloway died had nearly taken the ranch entirely. Elias had stopped managing, creditors had circled, and Rhett had been 29 years old dealing with all of it while also grieving, which was the kind of experience that either broke a person or built something that couldn't be broken. It had built something that couldn't be broken, but it had also built something that didn't easily let things in. She saw it at odd moments, the way he'd sometimes stop what he was saying mid-sentence, like he'd caught himself saying more than intended, and then finish the sentence differently than he'd started it. The way he looked at the ranch sometimes, in the late light, with something that was more complicated than pride. The way he'd learned to knock on the kitchen doorframe before entering, a courtesy that he'd taught himself and that she'd never asked for. She didn't push at any of it. That wasn't her way, and also she was carrying enough of her own complexity that she wasn't in any position to require someone else to open theirs. But she was aware of it, the way you're aware of something real. The news from Stone Creek came in pieces, and not always from where she expected. A woman named Frances Osgood, who ran the church hall and organized the twice-monthly community dinners, had apparently decided that the situation with Evelyn Hart was interesting enough to think about properly. She came out to Iron Ridge on a Wednesday in late October, arriving in a buggy she drove herself, and she was not what Evelyn had been bracing for. Frances was maybe 55, solid, with gray-brown hair, and an air of someone who had long since stopped being interested in what people thought about her opinions. She accepted coffee at the kitchen table, declined the offer of bread, and looked at Evelyn with direct, assessing eyes. "I was there when you arrived," she said, "on Main Street." "I know," Evelyn said. "I remember you." "I should have said something," Frances said. "I didn't. I'm not sure what I was waiting for." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I want to know how you're getting on." Evelyn looked at her. "Why?" Frances met her eyes. "Because I've lived in this town 30 years, and I know exactly what kind of story Gerald Finch is telling, and I know what it does to a woman's standing when a man with a store and a smile tells it." She paused. "And because my own husband left me for a woman with more money 22 years ago, and nobody in this town said a word to me about it for 6 months, and I have never stopped thinking I should have said something to someone." The kitchen was quiet. Evelyn said, "I'm getting on well. The ranch is honest work." "And Elias?" "Better." Frances looked around the kitchen. At the order of it, the curtains, the herbs hanging to dry near the window. "I can see that," she said. "The last time I came out here was Christmas 2 years back, and it felt like a house where everyone was just waiting for something to end." "It felt like that when I arrived too," Evelyn said. "Does Rhett know what Finch has been saying?" "He knows the broad lines. We've spoken to a lawyer." Frances nodded slowly, like that answered a question she hadn't quite asked. "There are people in Stone Creek who are not stupid," she said, "and there are people who have known Gerald Finch long enough to know the shape of him. I'm not the only one." She set down her cup. "I'm not making you any promises, but I wanted you to know you're not alone in how you're seeing this." She stayed another 20 minutes. When she left, Evelyn stood on the porch and watched the buggy take the curve in the road, and she felt something she hadn't expected, something thin and warm, the particular feeling of being seen by someone who hadn't needed anything in return for seeing. A week after Frances Osgood's visit, a letter arrived that Evelyn had been both expecting and dreading. It was not from Daniel this time. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar. The return address, a lawyer's office in Millfield. She opened it at the kitchen table, alone, in the early afternoon while Elias was napping and Rhett was out with Cole replacing fence posts. The letter claimed, on behalf of Gerald Finch, that there existed a signed agreement, dated 3 months prior to her departure from Millfield, in which Evelyn Hart had committed to an obligation of $120, representing the agreed compensation for services rendered in arranging a suitable marital match. It stated that this obligation remained unpaid, that Mr. Finch had fulfilled his obligations under the arrangement, and that Miss Hart was required to satisfy the debt within 60 days or face formal proceedings. Attached, on a separate page, was a copy of the document. At the bottom of that document was a signature. It looked like her handwriting. It was not quite right, something in the angle of the E, the way the T in Hart was crossed too high, but it was close enough that someone not familiar with how she wrote would not immediately question it. She sat with it for a long time. Then she went to her room and got the tin box and laid out her letters from Gerald Finch, side by side on the kitchen table. She found the one in which he'd asked her to sign in return a confirmation of travel arrangements. A single page, she remembered, that she'd signed without concern because it had appeared to be exactly what he said it was. She hadn't kept the copy, because why would she? He told her it was paperwork. She understood now how it had worked. She understood it with a cold clarity that was almost admiring in its ugly efficiency. The form with the innocuous framing. The signature obtained legitimately. The document then altered or supplemented. The terms filled in around the name she'd already put on the page. She picked up Aldous Webb's note from where she'd kept it folded under the tin box. She wrote the letter to the Millfield Land Office that afternoon. She wrote another letter to Aldous Webb, enclosing copies of everything. She wrote the most careful letter of her life to her brother Daniel, laying out exactly what she now understood, what she intended to do about it, and what she required from him. She sealed them, addressed them, and set them on the table for Cole to take to town. Then she made dinner. Not because she felt like making dinner. Not because the domestic rhythms were comforting to her in that moment. They weren't, exactly. But because it was 5 o'clock and Elias would come downstairs at past, and Rhett would come in from the fence at 6, and Cole would head home after that, and they all needed to eat, and the work needed doing. And she had learned that the best thing she knew how to do with Dread was to put her hands to something. She made the beet soup again because she had what was needed, and because Elias had said it reminded him of a good night, and she thought they could use that. When Rhett came in and saw her at the stove and the letters on the table, he stopped and looked at them, and she said, without turning around, "Documents arrived. It's what we thought. I've written to Webb and sent for records from Millfield." He picked up the lawyer's letter and read it standing in the kitchen in his work coat with the dust still on him. "The signature," he said. "It's close, but not right," she said. "I can show you mine." He set the letter down. She heard him pull out the chair and sit down. "You all right?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I'm angry," she said, "and I'm steady. Both at once. That's probably the right way to be." "I think so," she said. She stirred the soup. "Dinner in an hour." He didn't say anything else, but she heard him settle into the chair, not leaving, not going upstairs, just sitting there in the kitchen with her while the soup got itself ready and the light outside went amber. And the day wound down toward the particular quiet that Iron Ridge had at this hour, a quiet she had come to know the texture of, the particular sound of this house, this land, this unlikely collection of people sitting around a table that someone had once given up on. She was not done, not by a long way, but she was here, and she was standing, and the table was set for 3. The response from the Millfield Land Office arrived 17 days later, and it was worse than she'd calculated for. Aldous Webb came out to the ranch himself to deliver it, which told her something before he'd even opened his saddlebag. Men like Webb didn't ride 6 miles in November cold to deliver good news. Good news could wait for a letter. She brought him inside and poured coffee and called for Rhett, who came in from the barn with Cole's news that Webb's horse was in the yard and had been shedding tack like something urgent. Elias came down the stairs without being asked. He'd developed an instinct for when the kitchen held something serious, the way old animals sensed weather. They sat around the table, all 4 of them, and Webb laid out what he'd found. The land office in Millfield had filed on the 14th of August, 6 weeks before Evelyn left for Stone Creek, 2 documents bearing her name. The first was the altered travel confirmation she'd already identified. The second was something she hadn't known existed, a formal promissory agreement listing her as primary obligor on a debt of $120 with her brother Daniel Hart listed as guarantor. The document showed both her signature and Daniel's. Both were notarized. Notarized, Rhett said. Yes, Webb said. By whom? Webb tapped the copy on the table. A notary named Albright. Evelyn went very still. Mrs. Albright, the neighbor, the woman who had read Gerald Finch's letters with her and clapped her hands and said, "How wonderful." The woman who had, apparently, also witnessed and stamped a document that Evelyn had never seen. "She was my mother's neighbor," Evelyn said. Her voice came out level, which cost her something. "I knew her for 12 years. Nobody said anything to that because there wasn't anything useful to say." She looked at the document. Her signature, not the almost right forgery from the lawyer's letter, but her actual signature, clean and genuine, sitting at the bottom of a document she had never in her life read. Above it, the text she'd never been shown. Below it, Daniel's name and Mrs. Albright's stamp. She understood it now completely. The travel confirmation she'd signed in good faith had been a single page. What she hadn't seen was that behind that page had been this one, attached, and she'd signed through both with the pen pressing hard enough to leave an impression. Or possibly the pages had been assembled after. She'd handed back the pen without looking because she'd trusted the framing, and you didn't read the fine print on something your neighbor handed you with a smile. "This is how it was done," she said. "Yes," Webb said, "and it's clever. The notarization makes the forgery argument much harder. The stamp is real. Mrs. Albright will say she witnessed the signing. Your brother will say the same. Finch's position is that you knew about the arrangement and agreed to it, and this document is the proof. But I didn't. I know you didn't." Webb picked up his coffee. But what you know and what a judge can be made to believe are not always the same geography. Elias, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table throughout this, said, "What does Finch actually want?" Webb looked at him. "Right now? The money. The 120. He doesn't have that from the Whitmore marriage. Clara Whitmore's father controls the lumber money and by all accounts is not generous with it. Finch overplayed his hand there. He needed the financial arrangement from this one to go through, and when Miss Hart arrived without it, he lost both the marriage and the payment. So he's coming after me because the better deal didn't deliver," Evelyn said. Essentially, she sat with that for a moment. The specific indignity of it. Not even the primary injury, the discarded arrangement, the public humiliation, but the secondary one, the claim being made against her because the replacement hadn't been profitable enough. "What are my options?" she asked. Webb turned his cup in his hands. "You can pay. Ends it immediately. No proceeding. Finch goes away. I don't have $120, and I wouldn't pay it regardless. I know. Option 2. You challenge the document. That means a formal hearing, testimony, presenting evidence that the signature was obtained under false pretenses. The notarization is a problem, but it's not insurmountable if we can show the context of how that page came to exist. What do we need?" We need the original travel confirmation, if it still exists. We need witnesses to the circumstances of the signing. Anyone who was present when Finch first sent the paperwork, anyone who can speak to your understanding of what you were signing. He paused. And we need your brother. Daniel won't help me. No, Webb said. But Daniel's own position is more precarious than he may have calculated. His name is on this document as guarantor. If the document is genuine, he owes the money alongside you. If the document is fraudulent, his name on it makes him party to the fraud. Webb looked at her steadily. He has a reason to cooperate that has nothing to do with loyalty to you. Evelyn looked at the document on the table, at her name and her brother's name side by side on a piece of paper that represented the full scope of how she'd been handled. I want to go to Stone Creek, she said. Rhett looked at her. Not to hide from it, she said before he could speak. The opposite. I want to go in. I want people to see me, and I want to start talking to the people Francis Osgood says aren't stupid. She looked at Webb. Finch is building a story. Stories work when there's no competing story. I need to be in that town, visible, before his version is the only version anyone's heard. Webb looked at her for a moment. Then he said, That's not bad thinking. It's also, Rhett said carefully, not without risk. If you're there and people are talking, then they'll talk to my face instead of behind my back, and I'll know what I'm dealing with. She met his eyes. I'm not afraid of the town, Rhett. I'm afraid of what happens if I stay out here and let someone else write the ending. The kitchen was quiet. Elias said, from his end of the table, She's right. Everyone looked at him. He shrugged one shoulder, slowly. You let a man tell a story long enough, people stop wondering if there's another one. He looked at Evelyn with the direct gaze he'd had before grief dimmed it, the gaze she'd been seeing more of lately. Go to town. She went on a Saturday because Saturday was when Stone Creek had people in it. She wore the blue wool dress, newly mended at both cuffs now, and her hair pinned up properly, and she rode in on the wagon seat beside Rhett with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight. Rhett drove and said nothing, which was what she needed from him, and he pulled up in front of the general store and climbed down and helped her down. Took her hand without making a thing of it, the natural habit of a man who'd been raised with manners even if he didn't perform them, and they went inside. Mrs. Poole was behind the counter. Two women Evelyn recognized from previous visits were near the dry goods shelf. A man she didn't know was looking at tools near the back. Mrs. Poole's expression when she saw Evelyn was careful and watched. The two women near the shelf went quiet. Mrs. Poole, Evelyn said, I need sugar, baking powder, 2 yards of wool flannel and thread. Dark blue if you have it. Yes, Miss Hart, Mrs. Poole said. The shop felt held, not hostile exactly, but the particular quality of a room full of people who are working very hard at ordinary things. One of the women near the shelf, younger, with red hair and an honest face, said, Miss Hart, I'm Nell Greer. I don't think we've been properly introduced. We haven't, Evelyn said. It's nice to meet you. Nell Greer looked at her with something frank and slightly apologetic in her expression. My husband buys feed from Cole sometimes. Cole speaks well of how things are going at Iron Ridge. Cole's a good judge, Evelyn said. He is. A brief pause. I hope it's all right out there. It's more than all right, Evelyn said, and she meant it fully enough that it showed. She didn't lecture. She didn't explain herself or defend her position or reference what was being said about her. She bought her supplies, she spoke pleasantly to the people who spoke to her, and she let the fact of herself, standing in that shop, unhurried and unashamed, do whatever work it could. When she was done and they were loading the wagon, Rhett said low, Finch came out of the land office when you were inside. She looked up. And? He saw the wagon. He knows you're here. She finished settling the flannel in the wagon bed. Good. He didn't come over. Also good. She climbed up to the bench. Men who don't come over when they could have are working something out. I'd rather have him working something out than making his next move without thinking. Rhett climbed up beside her. He looked at her with something she couldn't entirely name, something that was caught between concern and something else, something she didn't examine too directly because it was not the moment for that kind of examination. You're different than you were in September, he said. She took the reins. I know. she said. Is that a problem? He looked at the road ahead. No, he said. It's not. Frances Osgood came to the ranch 3 days later with information and 2 other women. The second woman was Martha Deere, who ran the post office with her husband, and who, as it turned out, had noticed several things about the correspondence flowing through Stone Creek in the last few months that she was willing to speak plainly about. The third was Nell Greer, the red-haired woman from the general store, whose husband Ray had done business with Gerald Finch 2 years prior and had a specific memory of how Finch conducted his paperwork. They sat in the kitchen, all of them, including Rhett, who came in and stayed without anyone asking him to leave, and Elias, who sat at his end of the table with a sharpness in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. Frances said, Gerald Finch has been to see the county clerk. He's filing a formal claim, 60-day response period. He announced it to enough people that it'll be in the social conversation by Sunday. He's using the announcement as the damage, Evelyn said. Whether he wins or loses, half the county hears that there's a debt claim against me. Yes, Frances said. That's exactly right. Martha Deere, who had the manner of a woman who weighed her words on a fine scale before spending them, said, In October, a letter came through our office addressed to a notary in Millfield, from Gerald Finch. She looked at Evelyn. I can't tell you what was in the letter, but I can tell you the timing of it was the week after you arrived in Stone Creek. And I can tell you that same notary, a Mrs. Albright, sent a reply 3 days later that was collected by a man I recognized as working for Finch. The table was quiet. She replied, Evelyn said. 3 days later. Yes, which meant the notarization hadn't been a mistake made months ago. It had been confirmed, coordinated, possibly adjusted, after she'd arrived, and the public humiliation had already happened. Mrs. Albright hadn't just witnessed a signing in good faith. She'd corresponded with Finch afterward. Whatever the original notarization had been, she'd been an active participant in making it hold. That correspondence can be verified, Webb had told her. He wasn't here today, but she had his counsel clear in her head. The postal record, the dates, the sender and recipient, those are facts that don't require anyone's memory. Ray worked with Finch on a land purchase 2 years ago, Nell said. Finch prepared the paperwork himself, which isn't unusual, but Ray noticed that some of the terms on the final document were different from what they'd discussed. Finch said it was just cleaner language for the same terms. Ray signed because he trusted the man. She paused. He's been troubled about it since. He'd be willing to say that in front of whoever needed to hear it. Rhett said from his side of the table. What are we actually building toward here? Frances looked at him. A hearing. A public one. Evelyn contests the claim formally, and we make sure there are enough people present who know enough truth that Finch can't control the room. A public hearing isn't a trial, Rhett said. No, but in a town this size, it functions like one. What's said in front of the whole community is what the community believes. Frances looked at Evelyn. And Finch knows that. It's why he made the filing public. He's betting the announcement does his work for him, and that you either pay or go quiet. He's miscalculated then, Evelyn said. The women around the table looked at her. She looked at the document copies in front of her. Webb's notes, the land office records, Martha Deere's information about the correspondence, Ray Greer's account of the altered terms. She thought about Aldous Webb's words, "Don't let the other story fill the space." I need my brother, she said. Not because I trust him. Because his name is on this document, and he has a reason to tell the truth that has nothing to do with caring about me. Do you think he'll come? Frances asked. I think, Evelyn said carefully, that if I write the letter correctly, he'll understand that cooperating with me is better than being named in a fraud case. Frances nodded slowly. There's also Clara Whitmore, she said. Everyone looked at her. Clara's father refused to give Finch the money he was expecting, Frances said. Clara told me this herself last week. Whitmore looked into Finch's books before agreeing to the financial side of the marriage and didn't like what he found. The arrangement between Clara and Finch is cooler now than it was in September. She looked at Evelyn with something measured in her expression. Clara is not stupid, and she's been thinking about what you said to her, Evelyn remembered. I'd suggest you pay some attention to what kind of man considers a woman a possibility. She hadn't been kind in that moment, exactly. She'd been honest, which wasn't always the same thing. Would she talk to me? Evelyn asked. I think she might, Frances said. if you asked her. Met. She wrote to Daniel that evening. She wrote it at the kitchen table after everyone had gone, in the quiet of the house, with only the stove for company and the lamp making its small circle of light. She wrote it without anger this time. Anger had been right for the first letter. It had told him she knew and that she wasn't afraid to say so. This letter needed something different. This letter needed to be cold and clear and specific about what was going to happen and what he stood to lose. She told him exactly what documents existed with his name on them. She told him what she knew about the Millfield correspondence and what the postal record would show. She told him that a formal hearing was being organized in Stone Creek and that she intended to present every piece of evidence she had, including his name on a fraudulent promissory note, unless he came to Stone Creek and told the truth about what he'd arranged with Gerald Finch and what he'd known and when he'd known it. She told him she was not asking for his forgiveness because she hadn't done anything that required forgiving. She was offering him the only practical option that didn't end with both of them destroyed by Finch's version of events. She sealed it and set it on the table and sat there for a while. Rhett appeared in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't heard him on the stairs. He moved quietly for a large man, and he looked at the letter and then at her. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He came in and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, not because he'd been invited, but because they'd long since stopped waiting for invitations in this kitchen. He looked at the letter on the table. "He'll come," he said. Not a reassurance, just an assessment. "Maybe." She looked at the letter too. He's a coward in the specific way that means he does the easy thing. Coming here is hard, but being named in a fraud case is harder. She turned the letter once on the table. "So yes, he'll probably come." "And Clara Whitmore?" "I'll go and see her." She looked up. "Alone." Rhett looked at her steadily. She could see he wanted to say something and was deciding whether to say it. "I don't need she started. "I know you don't need me there," he said. "That's not what I was going to say." She waited. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who doesn't speak about the inside of things easily and is trying to do it anyway. "I want to say, I'm aware that this situation is mine to be in because you're at this ranch. If you'd gone to the hotel that first day, Finch might have let it go. He went after the debt because he saw you here and decided there was something to press against." She looked at him. "You think I'd have been better off at the hotel?" "No," he said immediately. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I know this came at a cost, and I want to be straight with you, that I know that." She was quiet for a moment. "Rhett," she said, "I would be at the hotel with $42 and a set of letters I didn't know were part of a transaction. I would know less. I would have fewer people, and I would have missed." She stopped, looked at the table. "I wouldn't trade this for the other thing, even with what's coming." The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere. He said, "All right." And then, after a moment, "Good." Neither of them said anything else for a while. The stove settled. The house made its old sounds around them. Outside, the November wind was moving through the fence line and the bare garden, and the mountains were doing what they always did in the dark, just standing there, unchanged, not asking anything of anyone. Yet, Clara Whitmore agreed to meet her on a Wednesday at the hotel, in the front room where people took their afternoon coffee. It was public enough that neither of them was asking for anything private, and private enough that the conversation could breathe. Clara came in looking composed, the careful composure of someone who had been practicing it. She wore gray today, not yellow or green, and she looked at Evelyn without apology, but also without coldness. "I thought about what you said to me," Clara said, once they had coffee in front of them and the other two tables were far enough away. "On the street, in September." "I wasn't kind," Evelyn said. "No," Clara agreed. "You were right, though," which was harder to sit with than unkind would have been. She wrapped her hands around her cup. "My father looked into Gerald's accounts. He found that Gerald had been expecting money from your family's arrangement. He'd already spent against it." She was quiet for a moment. "When it didn't come, he came to my father about the lumber money, and my father said no. And now things are very—" She stopped. "Gerald is not the man I thought I was agreeing to," Evelyn said carefully. "What do you know about the arrangement with my family?" Clara met her eyes. I know that Gerald told me your arrival was a misunderstanding, that you had written to him speculatively and he had replied politely but made no promises. She held Evelyn's gaze. I believed him because it was easier to believe him. I know that now. Would you be willing to say that in front of people? What he told you and when, and that he specifically described my arrival as a misunderstanding of my own making? Clara looked at the table. Her fingers moved against the cup. He could make things difficult for me, she said. Socially? Yes, Evelyn said. He could try. A pause. But he's making them difficult anyway, Clara said, quietly, almost to herself. He's a man who makes things difficult when they don't go his way. I'm learning that. She looked up. What happens at this hearing? She asked. Evelyn told her. Plainly, without drama, the way Webb had told her. The documents, the testimony, the postal records, what Daniel might provide if he came, what Ray Greer could speak to about the altered paperwork. Clara listened. When Evelyn finished, Clara said, My father might also have something to say about the accounts, about what Gerald was expecting, and when. A pause. He's not a man who enjoys being made a fool of. No, Evelyn said. Neither am I. Something shifted in Clara's face. Not a smile, too careful for that, but something that acknowledged, briefly and honestly, the shared territory of that statement. I'll talk to my father, Clara said. Yes. Daniel arrived on a Friday, 11 days after she'd sent the letter. He came on the afternoon stage and he came alone, which surprised her slightly. She'd half expected him to bring a lawyer. Instead, he walked up the road from town to Iron Ridge on foot, which Cole told her because Cole had been to town for grain and seen him getting off the stage looking lost and asking directions. She was in the kitchen when he arrived. She heard the knock on the front door and she dried her hands on her apron and went to answer it. He was thinner than she remembered. His hair needed cutting and his coat was travel-worn, and he stood on the porch of Iron Ridge Ranch looking at his younger sister with the expression of a man who has run out of comfortable positions to take. Evelyn, he said. Daniel, she said, come in. She brought him to the kitchen. Always the kitchen, the room where things got decided at this ranch. And she poured him coffee and sat across from him and looked at him plainly. He looked bad. Not in the superficial way of the journey, but underneath it. The look of a man who had been carrying something heavy in a direction that was slowly becoming clear wasn't working out. I made a mistake, he said. Yes, she said. I thought... He stopped, started again. Mother was gone. The house was gone. I didn't know what to do with you. That sounds... He looked at his hands. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you saw a problem to be solved, she said, and you solved it in the direction that cost you the least. He didn't deny it. She gave him some credit for that. Finch wasn't supposed to... He pushed a hand through his hair. The agreement was that he'd take you, and the money would follow from the property sale. But the property sold for less than I expected, and I told him the full amount wasn't coming yet, and he stopped. He decided to collect it from me directly, Evelyn said. I didn't know he'd file against you. When I found out, you wrote a letter to protect yourself, she said, not to warn me. He looked at her, the specific look of someone being shown themselves in a mirror they didn't want to stand in front of. Yes, he said. The kitchen was quiet. She looked at her brother across the table. He was 31 years old and he looked 10 years older than that. And she knew his life had not been easy, and she knew that easy lives didn't automatically produce good decisions. And she knew that none of this changed what he'd done. But she had not brought him here for an apology. She'd brought him here because she needed what he knew and what he could confirm. I need you to tell the truth at the hearing, she said, about what you arranged with Finch, about what you knew about the documents, about Mrs. Albright and what she agreed to. She looked at him steadily. If you do, I will tell Webb that your cooperation was genuine and that the fraud originated with Finch. Your name will still be in the record, but it won't be in the same position. He was quiet for a long time. And if I don't, he said, then I'll let Webb present what the postal record shows and what the notarized document shows, and your name will be where it is regardless, without the cooperation on your side. She said it without heat, just the facts of it. The difference is whether you get to say your piece first. He looked at the table, at his hands. at the coffee she'd poured him. "I'll tell the truth," he said. She nodded. Rhett appeared in his kitchen doorway then, coming in from outside, and stopped when he saw Daniel. He looked from Daniel to Evelyn. "Rhett Calloway," she said. "This is my brother, Daniel Hart." The two men looked at each other across the kitchen. The particular look of men sizing each other up around a woman who is sitting between them, not asking for either of their opinions. Rhett said, "You'll be staying for dinner." It was not a question. Daniel looked at Evelyn. "You'll stay for dinner," she confirmed. "We have things to go over." She got up and went back to the stove. Behind her, she heard Rhett pull out a chair and sit down. And after a moment, she heard Daniel do the same. The scrape of the chair on the kitchen floor. The settling of two men who would not have chosen each other's company, but were here because she needed them both, and she had stopped asking for easy. The soup was on the stove. The table was set. The hearing was 12 days away. She was ready for it in a way she hadn't been ready for anything in a very long time. Not because she was certain it would go right, but because she had built, piece by careful piece, everything she needed to walk into that room and not be destroyed by someone else's story. Whatever came next, it was going to be on her terms. But the 12 days between Daniel's arrival and the hearing were the longest Evelyn could remember since her mother's final weeks. Not because they were empty, but because they were too full, every hour carrying the particular weight of things that hadn't been decided yet. Daniel stayed at Iron Ridge. There was no comfortable way to frame it. He slept in the small room off the barn that Cole occasionally used in bad weather, and he ate at the table with the rest of them. And the first 2 days were simply awkward, in the way that truth-telling often is when the truth has been a long time arriving. Elias watched Daniel with the quiet, accurate eyes of a man who had lived long enough to know what guilt looked like when it was trying to arrange itself into something more presentable. He didn't say much to him. He didn't need to. What Daniel did, to his credit, was work. He wasn't a ranchman. His hand showed that after the first day, blistered from fence work he'd offered to help Cole with, probably because standing still felt worse. But he didn't complain and he didn't disappear, and Evelyn watched him from the kitchen window sometimes and tried to locate something in herself that was either forgiveness or its absence, and found instead something more complicated and less resolved, the kind of thing that would take years rather than days. Aldous Webb came out twice more. He went over the documents with Daniel for nearly 3 hours on the second visit, asking questions in his careful, methodical way, and Daniel answered them without the evasions of his letters. Whether that was genuine remorse or the pragmatism of a man who understood his position didn't matter much to Evelyn's purposes. The information was the same either way. What Daniel confirmed was this. The promissory note had been prepared by Gerald Finch and sent to Daniel with the request that Evelyn sign it alongside him as a formality. Finch had described it as standard procedure for correspondence arrangements of this kind. Daniel had signed it himself and sent it to Mrs. Albright in Millfield, with instructions for Evelyn to add her signature when she stopped by to say goodbye before her journey. He believed, or told himself, that the document was what Finch said it was. What he had not done was read it carefully. What he had not done was show it to Evelyn, or explain what it was, or give her any reason to do anything but sign quickly and move on. "Did you read it?" Webb asked him at the kitchen table, pencil in hand. Daniel said, "Not closely enough." Webb wrote that down. "Would you have signed it if you'd read it closely?" A pause. "I don't know," Daniel said, then more quietly, "Probably not." Webb wrote that down too. The night before the hearing, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in her room in the gray dark and stared at the ceiling and ran through everything in a sequence she'd already run through 20 times, looking for the weak places, the gaps, the moments where Finch's lawyer could insert a question she wasn't ready for. She heard footsteps on the porch. Rhett's. She knew his now, the particular weight and rhythm of them. She got up and wrapped her coat around her shoulders and went outside. He was sitting in his chair, the one at the far end of the porch, and he had his elbows on his knees and was looking out at the dark. He didn't look surprised when she came out. She sat in her chair. The night was cold and very clear, the kind of November night where the stars had an edge to them, sharp and close. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "No," he said. She didn't know if he meant he also couldn't sleep or simply that he wasn't surprised she couldn't. Both were probably true. "I keep thinking about the moment I walked into that room," she said, "whether I'll hold up." You'll hold up. You don't know that. I've watched you for 4 months, he said. I know that. She looked at the stars. She wanted to accept that simply, the way he'd offered it, but the honest part of her said, I'm scared. All right, he said. I don't mean I'm not going to stop, she said quickly. I know you're not. He turned and looked at her. Being scared and stopping aren't the same thing. You can be scared and still do it exactly right. She held that. After a while, she said, When your mother died and you had to hold this ranch together, were you scared then? He was quiet for a moment. Every day for about 2 years, he said. Didn't tell anybody. Kept thinking if I said it out loud, it would get worse. Did it? No, he said. It got better. Not because I said it. I didn't. Just eventually it got better on its own. He looked back at the dark. I should have said it out loud. Would have been less lonely. She sat with that. I'm glad I said it out loud, she said. Yeah, he said. I'm glad you did too. They sat there until the cold drove her back inside, and she slept after that. Not well, but enough. The hearing was held in the Stone Creek Community Hall, which was a large room behind the church used for meetings, voting, and the twice-monthly dinners Francis Osgood organized. It had long wooden benches, a raised platform at one end with a table and chairs, and windows on both sides that in November let in a flat gray light. It was full. Evelyn had not expected it to be this full. She had expected witnesses and a handful of observers and the interested parties and their representation. What she walked into was Stone Creek. Most of Stone Creek, it seemed, the benches crowded, people standing along the walls, the particular hushed energy of a room full of people who understand that something real is happening. She walked in with Rhett on one side and Daniel on the other and Webb a step behind, and she felt the room notice her arrival the way a room does when it's been waiting for the central person to appear. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, and she went to the table that had been designated for her party and sat down. Gerald Finch was already seated at the opposing table. He had a lawyer with him, a man named Tully from the county seat, who wore a good coat and had the smooth, assembled manner of someone accustomed to winning on presentation. Finch himself was dressed carefully, composed, and he looked at Evelyn when she came in with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who has decided the situation is still manageable. She looked back at him without expression and looked away. Beside Finch was a woman Evelyn didn't recognize until Frances, behind her, leaned forward and murmured, Mrs. Albright came. And yes, there she was, the neighbor who had stamped the document, older than Evelyn remembered, or maybe just smaller seeming. She didn't meet Evelyn's eyes. The presiding official was a county magistrate named Harlan Cross, who had ridden in from the county seat specifically for this, and who had the air of a man who had presided over enough of these to know that the truth usually surfaced eventually, but that the process of surfacing it was almost never dignified. He called the room to order, and the room went quiet with the efficiency of people who had been waiting long enough to be ready. Tully went first, presenting Finch's claim. He was polished and reasonable, and he laid out the document, the notarization, the obligation, the timeline, in the clean, assembled way of a man presenting evidence he believed was unassailable. He called Finch to give a brief account. Finch spoke clearly, the confident voice of a man in his own town, and described the arrangement as a standard business agreement entered into voluntarily by all parties. He did not once look at Evelyn. Webb stood when it was his turn, and he was, by contrast, plain. No flourish, no performance. He introduced the postal records from Martha Deere, who stood and gave her account in the specific factual language of a woman who kept records and trusted them. He introduced Ray Greer, who described what had happened with his own document 2 years prior, the altered terms, the trust he'd extended, the nagging sense afterward that something hadn't been right. Tully objected to the relevance, and Cross overruled him, because the pattern of behavior was relevant and everyone in the room knew it. Then Webb called Daniel. Daniel came to the front of the room and sat in the chair that had been placed on the platform, and he looked, Evelyn thought, like a man who had rehearsed this and was now discovering that rehearsal and the actual moment were two different things. He was pale. His hands on his knees were not quite still. Webb walked him through it. The arrangement, the documents, the instructions to Mrs. Albright, what he had and hadn't read, what he had and hadn't told his sister. Did Evelyn Hart know what she was signing? Webb asked. Daniel looked at the table in front of him for a moment. "No," he said. His voice was steady, but the single word cost him something visible. She did not. Did she have any understanding that the document represented a financial obligation? "No, I told her—" He stopped. "I didn't tell her anything specific. I told her it was paperwork." "Whose instruction was it to have her sign?" "Gerald Finch's." A sound moved through the room, not dramatic, more like the collective breath of people whose suspicion has been confirmed. Tully cross-examined Daniel hard, pressing on his own involvement, his own signature, the question of whether he had knowingly participated in a fraudulent arrangement. Daniel held up. He didn't make himself the victim. Evelyn noticed that, and she thought it cost him something extra to resist the temptation. But he was clear about what he'd done, and what he'd understood, and what he hadn't. When Daniel came back to the table, he sat down beside Evelyn, and she could feel the tension leaving him in increments, the way tension does when a thing that's been dreaded is finally just happening. She didn't say anything to him, but she didn't move away. Then Webb called Clara Whitmore. This was the moment the room shifted in a way that didn't shift back. Clara came forward in a dark blue dress, no jewelry, hair pinned back plain. She sat in the chair, and she looked at the magistrate, and not at Gerald Finch, which Evelyn watched for and noted. "Miss Whitmore," Webb said, "when Miss Hart arrived in Stone Creek in September, how did Mr. Finch describe the circumstances of her arrival to you?" Clara's hands were folded in her lap. "He told me she had written to him expressing interest in a correspondence arrangement, and that he had replied politely but made no promises. He said her arrival was a misunderstanding on her part." "Did he indicate he had made a formal written arrangement with Miss Hart?" "No. He specifically said no formal arrangement existed." "Did he say anything about money? About a financial aspect to the correspondence?" Clara paused for just a moment. "He told me, when my father was reviewing his accounts, that there was a sum he was owed from a previous business matter that hadn't been paid. He didn't name Miss Hart specifically in that conversation." "But you understood it to be related to her situation?" "Later, yes, when I understood more of what had happened." Tully rose to cross-examine, and he was less smooth now. There was an edge of damage control in his questioning that hadn't been there before. He challenged Clara's interpretation, her timeline, the precision of her memory. Clara answered calmly and specifically, and she did not bend. Evelyn understood that this was costing Clara something too: social capital, her association with Finch, possibly her standing with certain people in this room, and she held that quietly. Then Webb introduced Thomas Whitmore himself, who came forward with the bearing of a man who had made his money in lumber by not tolerating things that wasted his time, and who presented a brief, devastating summary of the financial discrepancies he'd found in Gerald Finch's accounts, including an anticipated receipt from a prior correspondence arrangement that had been carried forward as an asset against which Finch had borrowed. "He had already spent money he expected to collect from an arrangement that hadn't delivered," Webb said to the room more than the magistrate. The claim against Miss Hart was not the collection of a legitimate debt. It was the collection of a sum he had already spent. Tully objected. Cross sustained it, told Webb to stay factual. Webb sat down looking entirely untroubled. Evelyn was called last. She walked to the platform and sat in the chair and looked at Magistrate Cross, and then let her eyes go to the room, because she had decided she was not going to speak to only one person when the room was what needed to hear her. Webb asked her to describe, in her own words, the circumstances of signing the document. She described it plainly. Mrs. Albright, the visit, the paper she'd been handed, what she'd been told, what she'd seen, what she had and hadn't been shown. She described the meeting with Gerald Finch on Main Street, the letters she had kept with their dates, the specific language in each one. She described arriving in Stone Creek with $42 and nowhere to go, which she said without shame, because shame was exactly what this entire scheme had been designed to produce in her, and she was done producing it on request. Tully cross-examined her, and he went at the signature, the central problem, the notarized page, the fact that her name was genuinely on it. He pressed on whether she'd read what she'd signed, whether she'd asked questions, whether her failure to read carefully constituted agreement to the terms. "Did you sign the document, Miss Hart?" he asked. "I signed a document," she said. "I was told it was a travel confirmation. I signed what I was told it was. What was done with my signature after I handed back the pen is not something I agreed to. But you can't say for certain what you signed. I can say with certainty what I was told I was signing, she said. I can say with certainty that my name was on a single page when I signed it. I can say that the document you've presented has terms above my signature that I never read because I was never shown them. She looked at him steadily. And I can say that a neighbor I trusted for 12 years and a man I trusted to be honest in his correspondence used that trust to put my name on an obligation I never agreed to. That's not a debt. That's a trap. The room was very quiet. Tully said nothing else. He sat down. Magistrate Cross took 20 minutes. He went into the small room behind the platform, and Evelyn sat at her table, and the room made the particular noise of people releasing held breath and shifting on hard benches and speaking low to each other. Daniel sat beside her and didn't speak. Rhett was in the front row of the benches, directly behind the table, and she felt him there without turning around. Elias was there too. She hadn't expected him to come. He hadn't been to town in over a year. But he'd been at the breakfast table that morning already dressed in his good coat, drinking his coffee, and when she'd looked at him, he'd said, "I'll ride in with Cole." And that was the entirety of the conversation about it. He was in the back row now, she knew, because Frances had told her when they walked in. She hadn't looked back at him. But she knew. Cross came back in and the room went quiet again. He stated his findings in the precise language of a man who dealt in language carefully. The notarization was valid in form, but the circumstances of the signing had been materially misrepresented to the signatory. The postal correspondence suggested coordinated effort to establish the document's legitimacy after the arrangement had failed. The testimony of Daniel Hart established that the signing had not been informed consent. The financial evidence presented by Thomas Whitmore established that the claimed debt had already been treated as a received asset before any proceeding to collect it, which spoke to the intent behind the filing. The claim against Evelyn Hart was dismissed. The document was declared invalid. The filing was to be struck from the county record. The room erupted, not in celebration exactly, more in the released pressure of a crowd that had been holding something, people talking, moving, the benches scraping. Evelyn sat still for a moment in the middle of it. She heard Tully say something clipped to Finch, and she heard Finch's voice, lower, and she didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Webb put his hand briefly on her arm and said, "Well done," in the tone of a man who meant it simply. Daniel said, from beside her, "Evelyn," just her name. She turned and looked at him, this brother who had done what he'd done and had come back and told the truth about it anyway, and she saw in his face something that wasn't cleaned up or resolved but was genuine. "Thank you for coming," she said. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something real, and she meant it. She stood up and turned and found Rhett directly behind her, standing now that the benches had emptied into movement, and he was looking at her the way he sometimes looked at the ranch when something had been fixed that had long been broken. Not triumphant, just quietly certain. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And she was, actually. Not in the clean storybook way, not without the residue of everything this had cost. The months of uncertainty. The specific pain of Mrs. Albright's betrayal, the complicated weight of Daniel standing in that chair. But underneath all of it, something solid that hadn't been there before. Frances Osgood materialized at her elbow and embraced her firmly and said, "Come," and walked her through the room, and people made way, and some of them spoke to her. Nell Greer, who pressed her hand, the feed store owner who nodded with something like apology. And she moved through them the way a person moves through a place where they belong. Not untouched, but not fragile. At the door, she stopped. Gerald Finch was across the room near the far exit, deep in conversation with Tully. He looked smaller than he had on the church steps in September. Not physically, but the composed assurance had cracked somewhere during the last 2 hours, and what was underneath it was just a man who had overplayed his hand and now had to live in a town that knew it. He felt her looking and met her eyes. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough that it was deliberate, and then she turned and walked out of the building into the November afternoon, where the cold air hit her face and the street was ordinary and wide and full of the particular gray light of a day that was just a day, not a story, not a crisis, just Stone Creek on a Tuesday, with horses at the posts and smoke from the chimneys and the distant mountains wearing their first real snow of the season. Rhett came out behind her. She heard Elias's voice from somewhere to her left. He was talking to someone she didn't immediately identify, his voice carrying the old authority that grief had suppressed for 4 years, the voice of a man who was back. She stood on the street and breathed. "Let's go home," she said. Rhett looked at her. Something moved across his face that he didn't have a word for yet, or if he did, it wasn't the moment for it. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." The ride back to Iron Ridge that afternoon was the quietest of all the rides she'd made on that road, and she'd made enough of them by now to know its every curve and rut by feel. Daniel rode with them in the wagon bed, which nobody had discussed. It had simply happened, Cole pulling the wagon around and Daniel climbing up without asking whether he was welcome, and nobody telling him he wasn't. Elias sat on the bench beside Rhett, which was unusual enough that Evelyn noticed it, the old man choosing the front instead of the covered back, looking at the road and the land with the eyes of someone reacquainting themselves with the world. Nobody talked much. There wasn't a need for it. The hearing had used up a particular kind of language, and what remained felt better served by the sound of the horses and the cold air and the mountains doing what they always did. About halfway home, Elias said, to no one in particular, and everyone at once, "Margaret would have liked you." Evelyn was in the wagon bed and almost missed it over the sound of the wheels. But she heard it. She didn't say anything. She didn't think he'd said it to get a response. He was looking at the road still, his good coat buttoned up against the cold, and after a moment he said nothing else. But she held it the rest of the way home, the way you hold something small and solid that has more weight to it than its size suggests. Gerald Finch left Stone Creek by the end of the month. Not dramatically, no announced departure, no confrontation. He simply closed the dry goods store one Wednesday, and by Thursday people were noticing the shutters were up, and by Friday it was generally understood that he'd loaded a wagon the previous night and gone. Clara Whitmore's father had apparently moved quickly on the financial discrepancies that had surfaced during the hearing, and Tully had sent a letter to Finch suggesting that remaining in Stone Creek was not in his legal interest. Francis Osgood told Evelyn this over coffee at the hotel on a Saturday in early December, with the particular satisfied brevity of a woman who considers justice a practical matter and not a spiritual one. "Did Clara know he was leaving?" Evelyn asked. "She knew before most people," Francis said. "I think she'd already known it was coming for a while." She turned her cup. "She's not heartbroken, if that's what you're wondering. Relieved, I'd say, which is its own kind of sad." Evelyn thought about Clara in that dark blue dress, sitting straight in the hearing chair, speaking plainly about a man she'd agreed to marry. There was something to be said for the specific courage of doing the right thing when the right thing cost you something you'd wanted. "She did well," Evelyn said. "She did," Francis agreed. "You should tell her that." Evelyn did the following week. She left a note at the millinery shop, short and direct. "What you did at the hearing mattered. I want you to know I see that." She didn't wait for a response. She'd said what she meant, and that was enough. Clara sent back 3 words on a small card. "Thank you. Likewise." Evelyn kept the card. She wasn't entirely sure why. But Mrs. Albright was a different matter. Aldous Webb had told her, after the hearing, that there were grounds for a separate complaint against Mrs. Albright for her participation in the document scheme, the correspondence with Finch, the notarization under misrepresented circumstances, the active coordination. He presented the option without pressure, letting her decide. She sat with it for 2 days. The anger was still there when she thought about Mrs. Albright. It was a specific kind of anger, the kind that came from betrayal in a familiar place, 12 years of neighborliness, of being known by someone, and that knowing being used as a tool rather than honored as a trust. Her mother had liked Mrs. Albright, had brought her soup when she was ill, had trusted her with the spare key. On the second day, she told Webb to let it go, not because she forgave it. She wasn't going to perform a forgiveness she didn't feel, and she'd made her peace with the fact that some injuries didn't get neatly resolved, just carried forward at a manageable distance. But Mrs. Albright was 63 years old and living alone in Millfield, and whatever Gerald Finch had offered her or threatened her with, she'd have to live with what she'd done, and Evelyn had learned by now that that particular weight was generally heavier than any legal proceeding. She had better things to spend her energy on. Webb nodded when she told him. "All right," he said. "That's yours to decide." "Yes," she said. "It is." Daniel left Iron Ridge on the second Thursday of December. on the morning stage from Stone Creek. He'd stayed longer than anyone had planned, 2.5 weeks in total, doing fence work with Cole and small repairs around the property that he'd taken on without being asked, the kind of work that felt like payment in the absence of anything cleaner. He and Evelyn had not had a grand reconciliation. They'd had a series of ordinary meals and a few conversations that were more honest than most of the conversations they'd had in the previous 10 years, which wasn't the same as healed, but was something different from what they'd been. She drove him to town herself. They sat on the wagon bench and the road went by, and the morning was cold and clear, with frost still on the grass at the road's edge. About a mile out, she said, "What will you do?" "Go back to Millfield," he said. "Try to sort out the property properly this time." A pause. "I've been handling things badly for a few years. I think I knew that." "Yes," she said. "I won't." He stopped. "I won't make decisions about your life again. I understand that I don't have that right." She kept her eyes on the road. "I appreciate that." "Evelyn." He said her name the way he used to when they were children, and he was trying to be serious, the particular weight he put on it. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't fix it," she said. "But I hear you." He nodded and looked at the road. They rode the rest of the way mostly quiet, which was the right amount of quiet for what remained between them. Not comfortable exactly, but not false. When they got to Stone Creek, she pulled up near the stage office and he climbed down and got his bag from the back and stood there for a moment. "The ranch looks good," he said. You look like you're where you're supposed to be." She looked at him from the wagon seat, her brother, thin and tired and trying, standing in the morning cold with his bag. "Write to me," she said. "When things get sorted, I want to know." He nodded. He looked like he might say more and then didn't, which was probably right. He turned and went inside. She waited until the stage left, which took another 20 minutes, and she watched it pull out of Stone Creek and head east, and then she turned the wagon north and drove home. Quote, December at Iron Ridge was a revelation of a different kind. The cold came properly, and the ranch pulled inward the way ranches do in winter. The rhythm slower, the work different, the days shorter and the evenings longer. Cole kept fewer hours but stayed close to the barn, maintaining the animals through the cold with the focused care of a man who'd been doing it for 9 winters and knew exactly what each one needed. Elias spent more time downstairs. He'd taken over the checkers board from Evelyn and started teaching Cole to play, which was not an obvious pairing but turned out to work in the way of things that shouldn't work but do. Cole sitting across from Elias in the evening with the same focused silence he brought to everything, and Elias explaining the strategy in a voice that had recovered most of its old authority, the voice of a man with opinions and the willingness to hold them. Evelyn cooked for winter. She put up preserves from the last of the garden stores and dried herbs in bundles from the kitchen ceiling and made the bread every 2 days that the house had gotten used to expecting. She mended everything that needed mending and made 2 new curtains for the upstairs windows from the dark blue flannel she'd bought in October. And she learned which of the horses would take a carrot gently and which one required you to keep your fingers flat. She stopped waiting for something to go wrong. That was the thing she noticed, slowly, over the course of those December weeks. The specific absence of attention she'd been carrying since before she'd arrived in Stone Creek, maybe since before she'd left Millfield, maybe since her mother got sick and the world had stopped feeling solid. The bracing, the readiness for bad news. She'd been living in a crouch for so long she hadn't known she was in one. It didn't go away all at once, and it didn't go away completely. She still woke some nights with her heart going fast and a vague sense of threat that took a moment to locate, and then couldn't be located because it wasn't real. She still sometimes read Rhett's expression too quickly, searching for displeasure or the early signs of a situation deteriorating, and then caught herself doing it and felt the mild embarrassment of old habits. But the crouch was lifting, degree by degree, the way everything on this ranch changed. Not in moments, but in the accumulation of ordinary days. Rhett gave her the lantern on a Tuesday evening in the middle of December, which was not a special day in any recognized way, which was maybe the point. She'd been in the kitchen finishing the bread cleanup when he came in from outside and set something on the table. She turned and looked at it. It was a lantern, small, hand-sized, made of dark iron with glass panels on 4 sides. The ironwork around the top and base had been shaped into a simple leaf pattern, The kind of detail that required patient work, hours of it, the kind of thing you did late in the evening when you should probably be sleeping. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. He was standing a few feet away with his hands in his coat pockets, not performing casualness, but not entirely comfortable either, in the way of a man who has made something with his hands and is now confronting the vulnerability of having made it. "Cole has a forge," he said, "in the back of the barn." "I know," she said. "I've been working on it a while." She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, the iron solid, the glass set cleanly in its frames. She turned it, and the leaf pattern caught the lamplight. "It's beautiful," she said. And then, because honesty had become the language between them, "You made this for me." "Yes," he said. She set it down and looked at him. He said, "I want to say something, and I'd like to say it without it coming out wrong, which I can't entirely guarantee." "All right," she said. He took a breath. "When I offered you work in September, I was solving a practical problem. I needed someone. You needed work. It was a transaction, and I treated it like one." He looked at the lantern on the table, not at her. "Somewhere after that, it stopped being a transaction. I don't know exactly when. It was somewhere in the soup, I think." She felt something loosen in her chest. "The soup," she said. "The first night, you set 3 places." He looked up at her. "Nobody had done that in 4 years. My father, I hadn't—" He stopped. "I noticed. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say, and I'm not good at saying things anyway, but I noticed." "I know you noticed," she said. He looked at her. "I see you, Rhett," she said. "I've been seeing you for 4 months. You're not as hard to read as you think you are." Something moved across his face that was somewhere between surprised and something warmer. "I'm not offering you a grand life," he said. "This ranch is there are still hard years ahead. The cattle numbers are still low, and the fence on the north ridge needs replacing properly in the spring. And my father is getting older, and some days are—" "Rhett," she said. He stopped. "I know all of that," she said. "I've been living it with you." He was quiet for a moment. "What I want to offer," he said, "is that your name is safe here. Whatever comes, whatever the next thing is, your name is mine to protect, and I won't treat it as anything less than that." The kitchen was very still. The bread smell was still in the air, warm and ordinary, and outside the December wind moved around the corners of the house in the familiar way it had. She'd been offered a future before. She knew what a future offered as a transaction looked like. The careful handwriting and the promises that turned out to be about money, not about her. She knew the difference between being wanted for what you represented and being wanted for what you actually were. This was not a transaction. She picked up the lantern. "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I want you to know that. I could leave. I have $8 a month saved and people in this town who would help me if I needed it." She looked at him steadily. "I'm staying because I want to. Because this place, these people." She paused. "Because you." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she set the lantern down just in time because he took her face in his hands, rough and careful at once. The hands of a man who built fences and made iron lanterns in the back of the barn at night. And he kissed her the way people kiss when they've been patient for a long time and have finally, reasonably, run out of patience. It was not a perfect moment. Her elbow knocked the flour tin on the counter and it made a loud sound, and they both startled slightly. And then she laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And he did too, the low rumble of it, and that was better than perfect. That was true. Okay. They were married in March, when the snow was off the lower fields, and the climbing rose on the garden fence had put out its first new growth of the season. Frances Osgood organized it because Frances organized things, and because Evelyn had looked at her one afternoon over coffee in January and said, "If I were to get married in the spring, who would help me do it without it becoming a town event?" And Frances had said, "Me, and don't worry, it'll be exactly as big as you want it." And it was. Small. The kitchen table pulled out to the garden, the chairs from inside arranged on the frost-soft grass, Elias in his good coat in the front row, with Cole beside him in the only suit Cole apparently owned, which fit him in the approximate sense of the word, Frances and her husband, Nell and Ray Greer. Aldous Webb, who had driven out from the county seat and arrived an hour early and accepted coffee without being asked. Daniel was there. He'd written in February to say he was coming, if she wanted him. She'd written back that she did, without qualifications, because she was done with qualifications that came from old hurt instead of present truth. He arrived 2 days before, and he and Rhett spent one evening in the barn doing something with the north fence plans that apparently required diagrams, which Evelyn did not ask about. The ceremony itself was short. A justice of the peace from Stone Creek named Harold Briggs, who had a cold that day and kept his voice low and got through it with the brisk efficiency of a man who understood that the ceremony was not the point. The people in it were. Rhett said his vow and she said hers, and they were plain words, not borrowed from a book. Just the thing each of them meant said out loud in front of people who knew them. When it was done, Elias stood up, slowly, with the effort of a man whose knees made him pay for standing. And he put his hand on Rhett's shoulder and looked at Evelyn with those dark eyes that had come all the way back from wherever grief had taken them. "Welcome home," he said, properly. She put her arms around him, which she hadn't done before. They weren't built for easy physical warmth, either of them. It had to be earned. And he held on for a moment with the particular grip of an old man who means it, and then he stepped back and wiped his eye with the back of his hand in the way of men who cry and pretend they're not. "Your soup needs salt," he said. "Always has." "I know," she said. "I've been waiting to see if you'd say something." He looked at her, and then he actually smiled. The full one, deep lines around his eyes. The smile of the man he'd been before. "4 months," he said. "You let me complain for 4 months before you fixed it." "3," she said, "and I fixed it in October. You just didn't notice." He laughed. She hadn't heard him laugh before, not like that, and it sounded like something the house had been waiting to hold again. The years that followed were not a story anyone would have written as fiction because they didn't have the neat shape of fiction. They had the irregular, lived shape of real time, with hard winters and good summers and cattle prices that were sometimes brutal and sometimes kind, and Elias's health declining in the slow way of old age rather than any dramatic event, and Daniel coming to visit at Christmas when the roads allowed and slowly, over years, becoming something that resembled a brother again, without either of them announcing that that was what was happening. Cole stayed. He was there so long that eventually he stopped being the hired hand and became something the language didn't have a clean word for. Part of the place, the way the barn was part of the place, essential and unannounced. The garden came back fully. Evelyn learned which things were Margaret's and which things were hers and which were both, and she stopped trying to separate them because it turned out that wasn't the point. The rose on the fence bloomed every summer in the particular deep red it had always been, and she cut it for the table and sometimes left a bloom on Elias's chair without comment, and he never commented either. There were mornings, cold November mornings especially, the kind with frost on the garden and the mountains going pink at their edges, when she stood in the kitchen with her coffee and looked at the table set for breakfast and felt the specific weight of how far she'd come from the woman who'd climbed off a stagecoach in September with $42 and a set of letters that turned out to mean something different than she'd thought. She didn't think about Gerald Finch much. He'd gone east, Frances had heard eventually, and that was enough to know. Some people just needed to leave the frame of the story for the story to be what it was supposed to be. What she thought about, on those mornings, was the thing Aldous Webb had told her. Don't hide. Don't let the other story fill the space. She'd done that. She'd walked back into the room and told the truth, and it had mattered. Not because the world suddenly became fair, which it hadn't, but because she had not let someone else's version of her become the final word. She thought about what that cost. The specific courage of standing in a room full of people who had watched you be humiliated and saying, "That is not who I am." The courage of not going quiet when quiet would have been easier. The courage of trusting that the truth, presented clearly and without performance, had a weight to it that lies had to work hard to match. She thought about Rhett making that lantern in the back of the barn at night, patient with the iron in a way he was patient with most things that mattered to him. And she thought about how sometimes the people who have the hardest time saying things say them in other ways, with their hands and their consistency and the fact of being present when they didn't have to be. She thought about Elias coming back to the table, how that had been the first sign that something in the house was going to be different before she'd understood what she was staying for, before she'd understood that healing a place you didn't plan to live in was the same as laying claim to it, whether you meant to or not. She thought about the difference between being wanted for what you represented and being wanted for what you actually were. She thought about how long she'd lived without that distinction being honored and how different everything felt when it was. The lantern sat on the kitchen windowsill. It had been there through 4 winters now, the glass cleaned regularly, the iron darkened by use. On evenings when the power went out, or simply when she wanted to, she lit it and it threw its warm, uneven light across the kitchen table and the chairs and the faces of the people sitting at it, and it looked like exactly what it was, something made by hand for a specific person with no other purpose than to give her light. Rhett came in behind her one of those mornings and found her at the window with her coffee, and he stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at. The frost, the mountains, the garden coming back under its winter cover, and neither of them said anything. After a while he said, "Good morning." "Good morning," she said. He poured his coffee and sat at the table and picked up where he'd left off reading something from the night before, and she turned from the window and started breakfast, and the house woke up around them the way it did every morning. The familiar sounds of it, and outside the mountains held their position against the sky the way they always had. Unchanged, indifferent, and somehow, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, completely enough. She was home, not because she had nowhere else to go, because she had fought for the right to say so, and the word meant something now. And she had put her name on this place the same way this place had put its name on her. Not with a document, not with a transaction, but with 4 months of soup and mended shutters and early mornings and hard truth, and all the ordinary days between then and now that had added up, without ceremony, into a life. Some people arrive in a place and are always passing through, and some people arrive and the place closes around them like a hand, and they close around it the same way, and afterward neither one is quite what it was before, and that is not loss. That is how belonging works. It is rarely comfortable and never clean, and it costs something real. But it holds.